This is a talk in a way that is well suited to the end of the seminar, because so much of what has been said in the other presentations has laid the groundwork for a discussion of purity as a positive virtue, as Hildebrand says in his book on purity. So let me just give you a preview of what I'd like to do, and a little bit of background on the writing of this book by Hildebrand, and then we'll look at the argument that he makes. It's probably a little bit ambitious in the sense that I'd like to cover sort of the argument of many chapters more than the ones that you were assigned, because I think there's a larger argument. So we'll just get as far as we can, and hope maybe in the Q&A we can further elaborate. So my preview essentially is that this book, of course, is called In Defense of Purity. Part 1 is on purity. Part 2 is on consecrated virginity. And the way I read the book, there's not just there's a way of reading each chapter as a rich meditation on an aspect of sexuality, sexual purity, impurity, all the different themes he takes up, also conjugal love. And then there's a way of reading the chapters in a way that treats them as part of a larger, comprehensive, cumulative argument for Van Hildebrand's account of purity as a virtue. And my hope is that you'll see as we proceed why this book is so much more powerful in light of that buildup that he establishes than if he had just written the chapter on purity as a positive virtue. In other words, imagine for example, his book, The Art of Living, which is about the virtues. And it's a very beautiful book on reverence and truthfulness and so on. There could have been a chapter on purity. But given the unique relationship of purity to the sexual nature of the human person, it would have been a very difficult chapter to write in a book like that as a freestanding chapter. So that's what I'd like to do. Now, a little bit of context on the book. I think all of you know that Dietrich von Hildebrand was a convert to Catholicism in 1914 at Easter. He was just 24 years old. He and his first wife, who then predeceased him, Gretchen, both converted on that occasion. And as we discussed yesterday in our musical evening, a powerful driver in his life of faith was the great art and the great music that he'd been exposed to growing up. It's interesting, sometimes I'm asked, I remember being on a radio interview, and I described the artistic cosmopolitan home, and the interviewer said something like, a heathen home, or I think that was something along those lines. And I said, no, you don't understand. This is precisely what paved the way for Van Hildebrand's conversion, not to turn it too much into an anecdote, but the conversion sort of came out of Shaler's statement that the church is the true church because she produces saints. And Shaler wrote a sketch of the person of St. Francis of Assisi. And it was a sketch that highlighted not just sort of character traits and habits and statements of St. Francis, but the beauty of his sanctity. And it was the beauty of sanctity and then ultimately the beauty of Christ that brought Van Hildebrand into the church. And that focus on the beauty of things as part of the essence of something, and ugliness as part of somehow something deeply contrary to the nature of great goods and values, is typical of Van Hildebrand. You might note that much of the way in which he characterizes things are through a lens of values and disvalues. And those values have a strong aesthetic component. Those are not just, this is not just like a personal mode of expression on Van Hildebrand's part. He thinks of the very essence of a virtue to be beautiful. Now, after his conversion in 1914, it's interesting, he didn't publish anything other than his habilitation, which he'd been writing, until he published an essay, an important essay as a Christian about 7 years after his conversion. But not until 1927 did he publish his first book, which was In Defense of Purity. And this was the result of his immersion in his wide Catholic reading. His conversion being of the sort that it was, being in a way more of an aesthetic conversion, moved by the beauty of Christianity, required a kind of deep education. And so he immersed himself. Apparently he spent hours in the library in Munich reading, immersed in the fathers and doctors of the church, especially St. Augustine. He also read in the lives of the saints. And of course he read in contemporary Catholic literature. So I would just say as an aside, if you think about it, he has this extraordinary philosophical education at the hands of great masters like Husserl and Scheler, but he has his religious education, with the exception of what he would have had in his formation before baptism or reception into the church, was entirely self-driven, self-done. So then consider a book like Transformation in Christ. I mean, imagine sort of reading yourself into the tradition with that level of depth. It's extraordinary. So what he noticed in all of the contemporary literature on matters of sex was that purity was never discussed as a positive virtue. It was almost always handled under the aspect of impurity. And he thought that that produced not only a caricature of the Christian life, but that it skewed the way sexuality was perceived. It skewed the ability of the Christian and really the human being to live an integral sexuality. It amounted more to a kind of repression or looking away. And then, of course, there were all sorts of psychological ways in which that would express itself in prudery and so on. So he wanted to write an account of purity as a positive virtue. And so this is that book. I think it's important to say that because there's a strong sort of ethical tenor to everything that von Hildebrand writes. You never, when he's writing about the human person, it's not like he, even for methodological reasons, will abstract the person from the context of his moral being. But von Hildebrand is very serious to emphasize that this book is not a book of sexual ethics. In fact, he says in the foreword, which for those of you who've read the book, it's not in the assigned readings, but he says, the purpose of the book is an analysis of the nature of purity and virginity, not a study of sex education, nor the formulation of practical rules of conduct, not even a defense of purity and virginity against their detractors. For this reason, the question I shall primarily treat is not how much is lawful in this field, but what constitutes the complete virtue of purity and wherein the ideal of purity lies. So I think it's essential that we take that with us, because there's a tendency, even the title in English of the book sounds a little bit like a defense of conservative sexual morality, for example. He's laying the groundwork for that, there's no doubt. That you couldn't derive a liberal sexual ethic from this work, but he's not directly arguing for that, and so I think we need to keep that in mind. So Maria Federica already covered very well the first two chapters of the book, but with a view to the argument that builds over the chapters, I just want to sort of restate the essential shall we say, maybe thesis of these chapters. So chapter 1, which is on the difference between sex and all of the other bodily appetites. The essential takeaway is the idea that sexual experience reveals that sex is deep, central, and intimate, as he often says, by which he means, well, I'll read you a couple of quotations that capture this. We heard this earlier this week, in fact, several times. The quote, sex is essentially deep. Every manifestation of sex produces an effect that transcends the physical sphere and in a fashion quite unlike the other bodily desires, involves the soul deeply in its passion. And then he says later in that chapter, every disclosure of sex is the revelation of something intimate and personal. It is the initiation of another into our secret. So you have here, a kind of phenomenology of sexual desire. Now, he doesn't distinguish between my experience of my own sexual experiences versus my experience of others' sexuality, but I think it's quite clear that what he means would apply both to the way I experience sexual desire, say, with these characteristics of depth, centrality, and intimacy, but that's somehow given to me as well in the way in which others comport themselves. In other words, this sexual being is something we all have, and so we all act out of that depth, centrality, and intimacy, at least, if we're not broken by the culture. But he's trying to conduct let's just say, an analysis of what he would consider a normal sexuality. So we have, you might say, the critical anthropological basis of an analysis of purity, which is that we begin with the idea, we are not just beginning with sexual instincts that have to be modified or directed. We're not just beginning with sort of the realities of procreation and social considerations. We're beginning with what is given in the experience of sexuality and what it reveals about the person. So it's a very deep conception of sexuality. and one in which the person is directly related, intimately related to the sexual sphere. So then we get to chapter 2. That's basically the thesis of chapter 2. It's terribly translated in the book as sex in relation to the spiritual life. I would propose from the German that it should be really translated sex in relation to man as person. That comes a lot closer to what's meant. And in fact, when you read the chapter through that lens, suddenly it starts to compute in a much deeper way. So the central case in this chapter, central thesis, is the idea of I'll read in a sort of an effort to make this all more succinct. I'll read here. Here's a first statement of this idea. He says, because of its profound centrality and intimacy, and also of its mystery, sex is capable of a particular relationship with love, the most spiritual and deepest of all experiences. And then he goes on, subsequently, he says, here we have to do with an organic unity deeply rooted in the attributes of wedded love on the one hand, and of the attributes of sex on the other hand. So the idea, drawing on the analysis in the first chapter, is that precisely the depth, that the way in which my person is intimately bound up with any sexual experience is at the basis of my ability to give myself in sex. And so you can see Van Hildebrand is sort of moving the argument forward here. He says in another passage, in a similar vein, he says that physical sex is certainly something distinct from love. Nevertheless, between sex and wedded love, there subsists a pre-established harmony. There's a long, interesting analysis in the book, which we can't go into, where he engages maybe the Thomistic position from one perspective. So those of you who are interested in the discussion of the different ends of marriage would find this very interesting. But he takes the view that he says quite clearly that one can't simply assign procreation as not only as the primary end, and I don't want to get into the theology of this, but let's just say sort of experientially it can't be the primary end. And he says, to overlook the union between physical sex and love, and to recognize only the purely utilitarian bond between sex and the propagation of the race is to degrade man and to be blind to the meaning and value of this mysterious domain. And he even says that even making procreation the conscious motive, as opposed to, just, I suppose you could, in a very kind of naturalistic environment, imagine people simply engaging in sex for pleasure and accepting procreation. So that would be very unconscious. But even to make it the conscious goal, he thinks does not suffice to sufficiently personalize sexuality. So he wants to say that love is essential, and it's the essential motive in any case that has to transform even the purpose of procreation. Now in chapter 3, which is a short and in a way difficult chapter because of the book, it's interesting, the book is on the one hand so clear in its own way, and the descriptions are powerful, but there's a certain kind of circular aspect. I don't know if you all have found this in reading this book, and so one has to sort of read this chapter very carefully to get wasn't always clear to me what even the three aspects were exactly. But what he wants to show here, this is sort of his value philosophy at work, is that sex is given in these sort of three different ways, in our experience, either in ourselves or in others. And he has this idea that that sex can sort of quickly cycle between these different aspects. And therein lies the great risk associated with sexuality. So going back to his opening analysis in the book, he says that sex can be given in its intimacy, its centrality, its mystery, its tenderness. He speaks also of its liberating character. So that's obviously sex not being sought just as a means of pleasure, but as gift. And then he says that there's something, he says this can even intrude onto a loving marriage relations. He says that sexuality can also present itself with a peculiar fascination, alluring and intoxicating. And this is when sex begins to be the object of our pursuit. And then finally he identifies what he calls the domain of evil lust, addressing a diabolical aspect in man. And this he doesn't think can sort of just, you might say the second, the fascination, the allure, the siren song, that might be best described as concupiscence. And we're always struggling with that. This domain of evil lust involves a kind of total giving of oneself, giving over of oneself to this sphere. And it's a powerful analysis, I think, and I think it resonates with all of our experience. It's hard not to see the effects of, for example, pornography in our culture, not just as sort of people who are caught up in something that is, sort of sensual and alluring and sort of preoccupying. There's this other dimension that Van Hildebrand is right to see. And so his subsequent analysis of sexual experience sort of operates with this idea of these sort of three different aspects, with obviously the idea that the pure person will live out of the aspect of intimacy, centrality, mystery, and tenderness. Now it's very interesting for all of the talk of not wanting to write about, the book is written sort of as a reaction to many books on impurity, but the mode of his argumentation is to arrive at the positive characterization of purity by looking at what purity is not. So as a result, he's going to look at impurity. And this is a very powerful chapter. This chapter made a tremendous impression on Dorothy Day because she found in it a powerful it's interesting. She was very taken by Van Hildebrand's ability to see, on the one hand, the great potential of sexuality in purity to be a mode of self-giving, but in light of her own experiences and what she saw in so many others, she thought that he had his finger on something very important when he captured not just the sort of brokenness and weakness of sexuality, but its potential for evil. So in this chapter on impurity, Van Hildebrand characterizes, you might say, certain core notes of impurity. But bear in mind, this is on the way to the positive reality. This is not meant, you might say, the way in which certain treatments of vices have a kind of fear-inducing effect to try to prevent you from engaging in a given sin. This is really done in a phenomenological vein. So we'll just cover three of them. So the first is he describes a flinging away of oneself. He says, I fling myself away by giving up this personal secret to another with no intention of a real and final surrender to that person, or entering thus into a lasting union with my partner. He also speaks of a specific squandering of self, the betrayal of oneself and one's partner. So there's that aspect. The next aspect that he discusses is what he calls desecration. This is a common theme in Van Hildebrand. There are many things that can be desecrated, but sexuality is a case in point. He says, as it is always a desecration to employ something destined for a sublime purpose in a fashion inconsistent with that noble object, as for instance to utter God's name thoughtlessly or irreverently, so it is in this case. So the idea is that the nobility of sexuality is such that any misuse of it isn't just a kind of, again, falling short. It's a desecration of a reality, of an exalted and even holy or sacred quality. Then he speaks of defilement. He says the moment any person in his employment of sex wills one of these two aspects, and he means the ones we discussed before, the siren song of sexual attraction and the diabolical lust, and gives himself up to those aspects, he incurs a mysterious defilement and separates himself in an altogether unique fashion from God. Bear that theme of separation from God in mind, because this is going to be central to his analysis of purity. So there you have, again, in a very perfunctory way, Van Hildebrand's characterization of impurity. And again, you can see how we're moving first from these anthropological considerations, then into what impurity is. Now we're going to look at another different kind of opposite. Chapter 5 is called Purity and Insensuality. It's one of the most significant chapters in the book. And it takes up, like an astute critique of purity. I'm not sure whether this is your typical critique of the idea of purity, but it's the idea that purity is not sort of a real thing. It's simply a temperamental disposition to be disinterested or maybe repressed. He doesn't discuss that. But it would be a variety of different ways in which sex would be just not part of someone's life. And of course, that's not a particularly attractive idea of purity. But Van Hildebrand proceeds to, he says it tells us, the absence of impurity tells us nothing of the incomparable splendor of purity. So it's not at all the real thing. And again, with a view to looking for some highlights in his argumentation here, I take two central ideas from this chapter. So the first is the distinction that he makes between purity, true purity, and mere temperamental absence of sexuality. And that's really part of a larger distinction between temperament and virtue. After all, purity is considered in this work as a virtue. And to draw this out, he distinguishes between the German words sinnlich and unsinnlich, which in this book is translated, I think it appears once in German as sinnlich, and then the translator translates it as sex, which is problematic. It's not false, but it's incomplete. The word sinnlich has the same, it's the root of the word sensual. So it has not only the sense of sexual, but sensual. So there's a broader quality that's meant there. In other words, one can be sinnlich without being, and in fact he says that one doesn't have to be sexual to have a strong Sinnlichkeit. But nevertheless, it's translated as sexual in this. And of course, unsinnlich would mean not only unsexual or disinclined to sex, but it would mean more broadly a kind of lack of vitality. So I'll read again some of his very vigorous prose here. He says, "To be sensuous is to be endowed with a fresh and vigorous life, with vital instincts that are powerful. This purely temperamental vigor of the instinct can manifest itself in different fields, among them that of sexual passion. By itself, it tells us nothing of its possessor's nature in other respects. For it is nothing more than a quality of temperament which can belong just as well to a spiritually minded person as to who gives the first place to the things of the spirit as to a debauchee." I wanted to be able to say that word, Christopher. It's a nice debauchee. Hope none of you have ever thought of becoming debauchees. "The spiritual man will endeavor to bring these instincts under the control of his will." So already in that characterization, you could say that, well, then logically, if it's possible for the man of great sensuality to be pure, then purity can hardly simply be the absence of precisely that sensuality. But Hildebrand takes it further because he wants to distinguish between the quality of the pure person and the quality of the insensual person. He really wants to defeat the objection at its basic level. So he says that purity is characterized, this is a quote here, by a spirituality of a distinctive kind, which not only controls the vital and physical aspects of a person's being, but actually penetrates and spiritualizes them. The Spirit illuminates the entire man, and his nature proclaims the triumph of the Spirit over the flesh. The pure man is specifically spiritual. His nature displays not only the appearance of something ethereal and dematerialized, as is the case of the man whose passions are weak, but a genuine transcendence of matter, whereby he is made free of the realm of matter. So if that in any way sounds suspicious, the point is not that that purity involves a kind of leaving behind of the material order. That's maybe a bit, I wonder what the German is, dematerialized, doesn't quite, an ethereal. The point really is that the spirituality of the pure person is perhaps along the lines of what Wojtyła calls integration. There's the material aspects, the physical aspects of our being are not suppressed or left behind. They're integrated into a being in which the spirit is fully alive, fully free, and not controlled by the passions and by those things that would rob us of our freedom. Then he says of the insensible person, this is an interesting, he wants to, maybe we shouldn't say so much purity is characterized by a spirituality. One could maybe say the air. So the air of the pure person is one in which there is this genuine transcendence over matter. And then the air surrounding the insensible person is precisely a lack of this triumph over matter. He says, so long as he is merely insensitive to sex and not also pure, the insensitive person is marked by a humdrum, prosaic drabness, which is even legible in his face, and is for the most part entirely devoid of poetry or charm. So it's the idea that purity, when it's alive either in the very vital person or even in the person of lesser vitality, is distinct from either of those temperaments, and that it, in the case of the vital person, transforms and allows him to live in freedom within his strong and vigorous temperament. And even in the case of the weak person, the person without this strong vitality, it's not identical, because that person would, by virtue of their purity, have some of that same spiritual freedom. They might not be as challenged by, for example, sexual impurity, but they would still live not in a kind of unconsciousness of their bodiliness. Now, the other point, which is very, very interesting in this chapter, it's not fully developed, it's just in one paragraph, and I think it probably is much more developed in the theology of the body. But it's this idea that the insensible person lacks a certain fullness of humanity. So rather than, in a way, welcoming the sort of the lesser, the tamer sort of personality as sort of, well, it's an easier path towards purity. It's an easier way to live. I'm not so driven around by my passions. But Hildebrand, in fact, says, no, this is an incomplete aspect of your humanity. And so he says, in a very striking passage, the sexually insensible person is as such an incomplete man to whom a very profound zone of human nature is closed. He lacks something indispensable to a complete humanity, and moreover not something that is confined to the vital sphere, for example, moodiness. So that would be, that would not be such a lack of your total humanity, but something which colors the whole of his nature. The pure man, on the contrary, is the only man who is truly complete. In him, a central orientation of human nature is fulfilled, and everything which the sexually insensible lacked, he possesses in its entirety. He says in one place that there are also certain dangers to people who are insensible. They lack a certain understanding for the struggle. They're maybe again at the temporal, at a level of not disposition, at a level of maybe increased likelihood. There are risks of pride, perhaps a certain looking down on people who seem to struggle so much. But Van Hildebrand wants to say that there's a kind of fullness of human experience. And if you think back to the anthropological basis, in light of the way in which our person is so deeply given in our sexual experiences, and the link between that, or the way in which that enables then this fundamental gesture of self-gift, you can see why for Van Hildebrand a strong vitality is in fact a great gift, one obviously that has to be formed and integrated. So we're finally ready for purity as a positive virtue. And this is a very interesting chapter, though I would say it would probably not have satisfied, I don't know if I would find it satisfying except on the basis of the preceding analysis. So he discusses, again, this is a sort of a gross simplification, but he talks about the attitude of the pure man, and then he's going to talk about the responses and actions of the pure man. So he says of the attitude, and this is vintage personalism, right? That a virtue is not just defined in terms of a habit or a set of actions that one completes with ease, but that it involves this dimension of consciousness. To be unconscious of a virtue is really to have a kind of blind habit. And so Van Hildebrand characteristically begins with the attitude, the conscious attitude. He says, the pure man perceives the mystery of sex. He perceives its depth and seriousness, its intimacy, whether because temperamentally awake to these qualities, he apprehends intuitively the character of sex, or because temperamentally unaware of them, he knows it from the outside. He possesses a deep reverence for the mystery of which he is here in the presence. Sex as such is in no aspect contemptible or base to him. So the attitude is, again, it would not be so meaningful without the prior vision of sexuality. In other words, purity, at least as described here, is an attitude towards sex. Well, it depends on what sex is and what on the person is. If one has a much shallower anthropology of sexuality, well, then the whole attitude towards it becomes more difficult. And note that the attitude is, well, we'll come back to this because there's a lot that could be said. In any case, this is the attitude of the pure man. Then he says, and this goes back to the point that we began to touch on before, he says, the pure man understands that sex belongs in a special manner to God, and that he may only make use of it as explicitly sanctioned by him. So here we start to come sort of full circle and really begin to either step out of philosophy. In Hildebrand's case, as a Christian philosopher, he can draw on a higher realm. But I suppose even even a non-believer could at least sort of recognize that this analysis pushes into territory that maybe can't be fully explained in natural terms. This is typical of an Hildebrand. Reverence is so much at the heart of things, and reverence for God is the ultimate reverence. Then he asks, beyond this attitude, he asks, well, is there a specific value to which the pure man responds? And he says as follows, he says, it is the splendor which attaches to everything united indissolubly with God, the Holy of Holies, and preeminently to that which reflects the light of holiness, which the pure man beholds and on which his gaze is fixed unswervingly. So how do we interpret these statements? The attitude of the pure man seems to sort of, as I said, it's grounded in the nature of sexuality, which Van Hildebrand unpacks, and I think is somehow given in experience. I don't know whether anyone would sort of deny those experiences of intimacy and centrality outright. Now, I know maybe in the broader culture, but in our context. And I think there's a way of making that clear to people. And then there's this further step, which goes hand in hand with the fact that he says in passages that I just don't have time to cover. He's very clear about the idea that purity is both a natural and a supernatural virtue, and he's after not just purity as a natural virtue, but as a supernatural virtue. It's interesting, some people would say, well, that's moral theology, can't go there as a philosopher, but he thinks as a phenomenologist that this supernatural purity is actually given. He says that nature's pure men have something of the purity of the mountain torrent, something of the clear, fresh air of early morning, but nothing which substantially transcends this world and moves into a higher region. He says, on the other hand, that the person who is pure in this full Christian sense, he says, it is only the supernatural union with God and surrender to him that can give the will of the human spirit power to construct these virtues with a fullness of content, a substantiality that is not merely analogous, as in the case of the natural virtues, but substantial in a sense incomparably more strict, and as genuine virtues, that is to say, habits. So I see that I'm running out of time, and there would be much more to say. There's a lot in his discussion of the difference between natural purity and supernatural purity. He says that the naturally pure person has the ability to sort of respond to impurity or to respond to purity and even follow that in his actions, but that he says that it falls short of a kind of understanding of the virtue of purity. Purity as something more general, as something to aspire to. It's a kind of maybe more reflexive response. And you saw his characterization. It's a kind of, it's the innocence of nature in a way, rather than the full consciousness of a person choosing purity. And then there's the further argument that he makes that purity in the full Christian sense, particularly if it's rooted in this idea of even a a recognition that certain domains belong to God. Not only is that not accessible to a non-believer, I mean, even if that's a debatable point, but I mean, the ability a non-believer may, again, this is Hildebrand's point as a phenomenologist, that a non-believer could see the supernatural purity of a saint and be led to conversion. In other words, it's not like a hidden reality that no one can see. It's given in their person, in their face, in their disposition. But he thinks that the ability to attain it is premised on that reverence for God, on the structure of grace. I'm not entirely sure whether the argumentation is sort of compelling across the board, but I'm with him. The only things that and maybe we can take this up in the Q&As, I'm not sure that he does justice perhaps to the capacity of a non-believer to go beyond just sort of kind of sensing purity and impurity in a given moment. It seems to me that perhaps even a non-believer can begin to have some sense of, purity as such, purity as a virtue, but perhaps lack the grace to attain it and then to see it fully. So why don't we leave it here and take it to discussion? The main thing I wanted to show you all is simply how his ability to arrive at his conception of purity, which he then carries on in the subsequent chapters beautifully in his discussion of marriage, and that's simply another thing. Maybe I'll end simply by saying, as far as those chapters are concerned, that it's very interesting how much this analysis of purity is in the context of the idea of marriage, right? I mean, it could have been a very different book in which it was more sort of purity for the single person, and he makes distinctions. He says purity and chastity are not the same thing, and but even chastity, of course, can happen both in marriage and in the single life. I think it's simply very revealing that this discussion is not just a discussion of purity, purity of heart, but purity precisely in a context in which the idea is that purity can exist in a very high form, even in its highest form, in a marriage, in a sexual relationship. It's not sort of ultimately left behind or compromised.